Here's something about urban legends that most people get wrong. They treat them as stories, campfire material, things you tell to scare people, cultural artifacts, folklore that's been passed down because it makes for good entertainment. What they actually are is memory. Every major urban legend that has survived across generations, that keeps getting searched, keeps getting told, keeps showing up in new forms, in new places, survived because it is carrying something real. Not necessarily the literal facts of the story, not always a specific woman who drowned her children or a specific ritual that opens a specific door, but a real experience encoded in narrative form, something that enough people encountered and needed to process that, a story formed around it and traveled. La Llorona has been part of Latin American culture for 500 years. Bloody Mary has been told in English-speaking countries since at least the 1972nd and possibly much longer. The Jersey Devil has 300 years of documented accounts from the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. 3 legends, 3 stories tonight from 3 people who stopped treating them as just stories and found out what they actually are. My abuela never told La Llorona as a ghost story. I want to start there, because that's the thing that made it different in our house than it was in most houses I knew growing up. Other kids heard La Llorona as a scary story, the weeping woman who drowned her children to be with a man who didn't love her, who wanders the waterways forever after looking for what she lost. The story you tell to keep children away from the river. My abuela told it as a warning system. She said, when La Llorona cries near your water, near your acequia, near your river, she is not looking for children. She is telling you that one of yours is in danger. You listen. You count your people, you keep them close. I grew up with that version, and I want to be honest about what that does to a child. It doesn't make the legend less frightening. It makes it more frightening because it gives the weeping woman a purpose, a reason, and a specific relationship to your family. I heard the weeping when I was 22 years old, and I didn't tell my abuela, and 3 days later, my cousin Teo walked into the Rio Grande and didn't come back out. My name is Esperanza. I'm 31 now. I grew up in a small town in South Texas along the river, the kind of town where the acequia system is still present in the older parts of the neighborhood. The irrigation ditches that the Spanish colonial settlers built and that have been part of the landscape for 300 years. My abuela had lived in the same house her entire life, across the street from an acequia that ran through the neighborhood and fed into the larger drainage toward the river. She talked about the acequia with a specific respect that I understood early. Not fear, respect. The way you respect something that provides life and can take it. She maintained the area around the acequia on her side, kept it clear, never dumped in it, observed a set of practices around it that she described simply as correct behavior near moving water. And she talked about La Llorona not the way people talk about legends, but the way they talk about weather as a real condition, a real presence, something that operated according to its own logic and that you ignored at your cost. It was October, I was 22, I'd come home for a long weekend and was sleeping in my old bedroom, the window of which faced the back of the property and the acequia beyond the fence. I woke around 2 a.m. The window was cracked. It was a warm October, and through the cracked window, from the direction of the acequia, I heard weeping. I want to describe it precisely because the precision is how I know what I heard. It was a woman's voice, low, continuous, the specific quality of grief that is past acute and into the sustained kind. Not sobbing, not screaming, weeping. The long, rhythmic, exhausted sound of someone who has been crying for a very long time. It had a quality I can only describe as wet, as if the voice itself carried water in it, as if the sound and the water were the same thing. I sat up in bed. My first rational explanation was a neighbor, someone in distress outside, someone I could help. I went to the window and looked toward the acequia. The acequia was visible in the moonlight, the water moving slowly, the willows on the far bank hanging low, The weeping was coming from the willows, and there was a shape in the willows. I want to be careful about describing the shape because the distance and the dark and the moonlight are all variables that affect what I could and couldn't see. What I could see was a pale shape, vertical in the willows on the far bank, not a tree. The specific quality of something that moved very slightly in a way the willows moved differently. And the weeping was coming from it. I stood at my window for a long time. I am my abuela's granddaughter. I grew up with the version of the legend that says this is a warning. And standing at that window at 2 a.m. with the weeping coming out of the willows, I thought about Teo. I don't know why Teo specifically. There were other people in my family I could have thought about, but Teo was who came to mind. He was 25. He'd been going through a bad stretch, job loss, a relationship ending badly, the kind of compounding difficulty that young men sometimes don't come out of. I had thought about calling him that week. I hadn't done it. I stood at the window and thought about Teo, and the weeping continued, and I made the decision I am least proud of in my adult life. I didn't wake my abuela. I told myself it was probably a neighbor, that I was being influenced by the legend, that waking my 80-year-old grandmother at 2 a.m. to tell her I thought I heard La Llorona in the willows would frighten her for no good reason. I went back to bed. The weeping stopped sometime before morning. I drove home on Sunday. On Tuesday night, my aunt called. Teo had gone to the river that afternoon. He had not come back. The search lasted 4 days. They found him on the 5th. I told my abuela what I'd heard 3 months later, after enough time had passed that I could say it without falling apart completely. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You heard her." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't wake me?" I said, "No." She was quiet again. Then she said, very gently, in the specific gentleness she used when she was saying something that mattered, "It wasn't your fault, Mija." She gives the warning. What people do with it, that's never been her responsibility or yours. I said I should have called Teo. She said yes, but you didn't know to call him because of her. You knew to call him because you already knew something was wrong with him before that night. She said she confirmed it. She didn't tell you anything you didn't already know. I said, then why didn't I act on it? She said, because acting on what we already know is the hardest thing there is. She can't do that part for you. I've thought about that conversation for 9 years. I've thought about what my abuela was saying, that the weeping is a confirmation rather than a revelation, that the knowledge was already in me and the woman in the willows was simply giving it form, making it undeniable for the 30 seconds I stood at the window, and I still went back to bed. I've wondered whether acting differently would have changed anything for Teo, whether a phone call at 2 a.m. from his cousin would have been the thing, whether the chain of events between that night and Tuesday afternoon was breakable. I don't know. What I know is that La Llorona came to the acequia behind my abuela's house on an October night, and I heard her. The weeping that my grandmother had described my entire life, the wet voice, the shape in the willows, exact in every detail to what I'd been told to listen for, and I went back to bed. And 3 days later, the acequia drained into the river, and the river did what the weeping had told me it was planning to do. I listen to moving water differently now. I count my people. I keep them close. And I make the phone calls, even at 2 a.m., especially at 2 a.m. I've never told this story publicly. I want to be clear about that, not because I've been hiding it, but because every time I've gotten close to telling it the way it actually happened, I've stopped myself at the same place, the part after the others left the bathroom, and I've told a shorter version instead. Tonight, I'm going to tell the full version. I'm 34. This happened when I was 13, which means I've been carrying the not full version for 21 years. I think I'm ready to put it down. It was a Saturday night slumber party, Jade's house, 4 of us, me, Jade, Becca, and Cora. We were 13, which is a specific age where you are simultaneously too old for slumber parties and cannot imagine spending your time any other way. Jade's parents were asleep by 10. By 11, we had migrated to the bathroom. I want to tell you that I was not the one who suggested Bloody Mary. because this is accurate and because I've noticed that whenever people tell this kind of story, there's a need to establish that they weren't the instigator, that they were along for the ride rather than responsible for what followed. Cora suggested it. Cora was the kind of 13-year-old who was always suggesting the thing that was one step past where the rest of us were comfortable, and we always followed her because the alternative was seeming scared. The ritual, as Cora described it, lights off, candle on the counter, face the mirror, say Bloody Mary 13 times. Standard. The version everyone knows. We crowded into Jade's bathroom. Small bathroom. The four of us barely fit. The candle lit. The light off. Cora started. By Bloody Mary 6, the giggling had stopped. By 8, Becca was closest to the door. At 10, Jade said quietly, "I'm done," and opened the door and left. At 11, Becca was gone. At 12, Cora, who had started it, looked at the mirror and looked at me and said nope and went through the door. I was alone in the bathroom. The candle was still lit. I had said 11. I want to tell you something true about why I stayed. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't a refusal to be scared. It was that I had been looking at the mirror since Bloody Mary. 8 and something had been happening in the mirror that I couldn't look away from. Not a face, not yet, not something that dramatic. A quality change in the reflection. The mirror in Jade's bathroom was old, the kind of old bathroom mirror that has slight waviness in the glass. And from Bloody Mary 8 onward, the reflection had developed a depth that it hadn't had before. Not the flat reflective surface of a mirror, a depth, as if the mirror had become a window into a space behind it that was larger than the wall it was mounted on. I was watching that depth. I couldn't leave it. I said 12. I said 13. I'm going to tell you what happened in the 4 minutes after Bloody Mary. 13 as accurately as I can. The depth in the mirror increased. Not dramatically, not a portal opening. Just a continued sense of the space behind the glass extending further than the wall it was in. At about the 90-second mark, a change in the quality of the reflection of the bathroom around me. My reflection was there, candle lit, familiar, but the bathroom reflected behind me was not quite the bathroom I was in. Small differences. I couldn't specify all of them. The towel on the rail a different color in the reflection, the angle of the counter edge slightly off. I was looking at a reflection of a different bathroom. And around the 2-minute mark, I became aware that in the reflected bathroom behind my reflection, something was standing in the doorway. Not in the doorway of Jade's actual bathroom, which was open. In the doorway of the reflected bathroom, standing still. In the candle-lit reflection, at the edge of what the light reached, a shape in a doorway. Watching me look, I stood at that mirror for 4 minutes total, and I looked at the shape in the reflected doorway. I want to tell you, I ran. What I actually did was back slowly out of the bathroom, facing the mirror, not turning away from it, back through the door until the door frame was between me and the mirror and the angle of my exit closed, the reflection off. Then I turned around. The 3 of them were in the hallway. Jade said, "What took you so long?" I said, "Nothing. I didn't tell them for 21 years. The mirrors started about a week later." This is the part I haven't told. Not just bathroom mirrors, any mirror, any reflective surface with enough quality to produce a clear reflection. And what I started noticing was not a shape in a doorway, nothing that dramatic, just the specific quality in the reflection that I'd first noticed at Bloody Mary 8, the depth, the sense of the mirror as a window rather than a surface, and in the depth. Not always, not every mirror, but often enough across 6 weeks that I stopped being able to walk past mirrors without checking. Movement. Not a shape, not a face, movement. The specific peripheral quality of something, adjusting its position just outside the center of the reflection, the way you catch movement in the corner of your eye, and when you look directly, it's resolved back to stillness. It happened in the mirror in my bedroom, in the mirror in the school bathroom, in the glass door of the shop we passed on the way to school, in the window of the car when the angle was right at night. 6 weeks, every few days, something in the depth of every reflective surface I passed, and then it stopped. I don't know why it stopped. I don't know what the 6 weeks were. I don't know if whatever I connected to on a Saturday night in a dark bathroom with a candle and a mirror had a specific attention span, or got bored or satisfied, whatever it was doing. What I know is this: the ritual has a specific number for a reason, 13. Not 7, not 10, 13. I've thought about why the others stopped early, whether stopping early is the correct response, whether the ritual is designed to take you to 13, and what waits at 13 is the thing you're supposed to see, and that seeing it at 13 and completing it is different from stopping at 7 and running. I don't know. What I know is that I said 13, and something in a reflected doorway watched me back out of the bathroom. And for 6 weeks, every mirror I passed showed me depth where there should have been a flat surface. And now I am 34 years old, and I keep my bathroom mirror covered at night. Not with a cloth, not with anything dramatic, just a towel over the frame before I go to sleep. Every night, without thinking about it consciously anymore. It's just the thing I do. And I think if you'd been the last one in that bathroom 21 years ago, you'd do it too. Hey, before the last story tonight, if these are landing for you, if you came here for the specific kind of story that takes a legend seriously and finds out what's underneath it, hit subscribe right now. This is what we do every week. And drop a comment, tell me which of the first 2 stories got under your skin more, the weeping at the water or the depth in the mirror. Because story 3 is about a journalist who spent 6 months in the Pine Barrens looking for the Jersey Devil and found enough to stop looking. I want to tell you something about investigative journalism before I explain why I stopped. When you spend 6 months on a story, when you've built sources and done the legwork and you're in the field regularly and the material is coming in, stopping that story is one of the hardest professional decisions a reporter makes. You stop when you can't verify what you have. You stop when the story crosses a line you can't responsibly publish across. Or you stop when continuing would put you in a situation you can't justify to your editor, to your readers, or to yourself. I stopped for the third reason. I've been retired for 4 years. I worked at a regional New Jersey newspaper for 26 years. I've covered crime, politics, environmental stories, community stories of every kind. I am a skeptic by professional formation. I believe in sources, records, verifiable fact. I spent 6 months looking for the Jersey Devil, and I found something I've told almost no one about. And I'm going to tell you now because I'm 58 years old and I've decided that keeping it is more trouble than letting it go. The Jersey Devil legend is the oldest documented American cryptid legend. I want to give you the basics for anyone who doesn't know it because the historical record matters to this story. The Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey, 1 million acres of coastal plain pine forest that sits between the shore towns and Philadelphia. Desolate by eastern seaboard standards. Sparse sandy soil, pitch pine, cedar swamps, isolated communities has been associated with the legend since the 1700s. The standard origin story involves a woman named Leeds in 1735, 13th child. The mother cursed the pregnancy. The child was born deformed and took flight up the chimney. This is almost certainly folk narrative built around something real that was encountered and couldn't be explained. What is documented across 300 years of recorded accounts is consistent in specific ways. The creature described is large, larger than a deer, bipedal or capable of bipedal movement, winged, capable of producing a sound that witnesses consistently describe as a shriek or scream that does not correspond to any known animal. Reports cluster around the cedar swamps and the more remote barrens interior. They appear in every century of documented New Jersey history, and they come from people who have no obvious incentive to fabricate. Farmers, police officers, military personnel during the various wars that brought people through that area. I'm not a believer in cryptids. I went in as a skeptic. 6 months later, I came out as something more complicated. My editor, Mina, had given me the assignment as a semi-ironic piece. The 300th anniversary of the Leeds birth story was the hook, a historical feature about an enduring regional legend, the kind of thing newspapers do for the Sunday magazine. I made it into something more serious than she expected. My first month, I did archive work, 3 centuries of documented accounts, newspapers going back to the 1800s, the famous 1909 week of mass sightings that shut down schools in multiple counties, the pattern of where reports clustered geographically, the Barrens interior, the cedar swamps, the old roads through the pines. My second month, I started interviewing living witnesses, not people who'd heard the story, people who'd reported encounters. Some going back decades, some recent. All of them, without exception, described the same elements in the same proportions. The sound especially. Every witness, regardless of age, background, or decade, described the sound the same way. A quality that was wrong for every known species in the region. A quality that carried further than the animal producing it should have been capable of carrying it. My source, Edwin, retired game warden who'd worked the Barrens for 30 years, said to me in our first interview, "I've been in those woods for 3 decades, and I know every sound this ecosystem makes. What I've heard twice in that time is not in my field guide." Edwin became my main source. He knew the Barrens the way a native knows country, the old road systems, the cedar water channels, the areas that local hunters avoided, and the reasons they avoided them. My third month, I went into the Barrens with Edwin, 3 separate day trips into the interior. I'm going to be honest about those trips. Each one was productive in a journalistic sense, and each one gave me material I published in the series. What I published was documented accounts, patterns, the ecological and historical context. What I did not publish from those trips was the sound. On the third trip, approximately 4 miles into the interior, at midday, in conditions that were clear and quiet, Edwin stopped walking. He said, "Listen." I listened. From somewhere to our east, not immediately adjacent, a significant distance, the sound. I want to try to describe it without reaching for the dramatic language that eyewitness accounts use, because those accounts all use dramatic language, and I want to be more precise than that. It was a vocalization, high in register, higher than you'd expect from something the account suggested was large, but with a sub-frequency beneath the high register that you felt more than heard. A physical resonance that corresponded to significant size. Duration of approximately 4 seconds, followed by silence, followed by the same sound again, 4 seconds, slightly closer. Edwin stood still. Then he said, "We should go back." We went back. I had recorded on my phone. I sent the recording to 2 acoustic biologists independently without context. Both came back with the same response. The sound did not match any species documented in the New Jersey ecosystem. One of them said, "Whatever made this is large. The subfrequency puts it in the range of something significantly larger than any extant North American bird or mammal species." I published none of that. I published the eyewitness patterns. I published the historical record. I published the cultural significance. I did not publish the recording. And in my 4th month, I stopped going back. Here is what happened in my 4th month that I have never told anyone. I had a source beyond Edwin, a woman in one of the old Barrens communities, family in the area going back to the 1800s, who had agreed to talk to me about the family's relationship with the legend. I drove to her house on a Tuesday in October 2003. We talked for 2 hours. As I was leaving at her front door, she said something I've carried for 22 years. She said, "You've been going into the interior?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You've heard it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "It knows you've been coming in?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It knows when someone comes into its country repeatedly, it notices. People who go once, it doesn't notice. People who keep coming back, it notices." I said, "It's an animal. Animals don't." She said, "I grew up a mile from the Barrens. My grandmother grew up a mile from the Barrens. My great-grandmother grew up a mile from the Barrens. I'm telling you what we know." I said, "What happens when it notices?" She looked at me. Then she said, "Nothing if you stop." I drove home. I called Mina. I told her I was ending the series at 3 pieces. She asked why. I told her I didn't have what I needed for a 4th piece. This was not entirely true. What I had for a 4th piece, the recording, the acoustic biologist's responses, The conversation on the doorstep in October would have been the best piece of the series. I chose not to write it. I have not been back to the Pine Barrens since October 2003. I'm not going to tell you I'm certain it works that way. That stopping going back resolved whatever had begun to develop in 6 months of repeated entry into the Barrens interior. I can't verify that. I'm not a believer in mechanisms like that. What I am is a journalist who spent 6 months building a picture of something that has 300 years of documented, consistent, credible witnesses, who found a recording that 2 independent acoustic biologists could not identify, who was told by a woman whose family has lived adjacent to the Barrens for 200 years that it had noticed me coming, and who made the professional and personal decision that the 4th article was not worth writing. The recording is on an old hard drive somewhere in my garage. I've thought about finding it. I haven't found it yet. And I think about what she said on that doorstep at least once a week, every week, for 22 years. Nothing. If you stop, I stopped. And I'm choosing to believe that was enough. 3 legends. A woman at the water who cries to warn you. If you know to listen. If you count your people. If you make the call you've been putting off. A mirror that becomes a window if you say the right number, if you're the last one in the room. If you see what's standing in the reflected doorway. And something in 1,000,000 acres of New Jersey pine that notices when you keep coming back, that has been noticed by 3 centuries of credible people, that made a sound that 2 acoustic biologists couldn't place into any known species. Here is what I think urban legends are. They're the shapes that real experiences take when enough people have them and need to share them. Llorona didn't come from nothing. She came from the specific and documented experience of people living near waterways in communities where drowning was a regular cause of death, who found that the grief of those losses sometimes announced itself before it arrived, who encoded that experience in a story that could travel across centuries. Bloody Mary didn't come from nothing. She came from the specific developmental moment when adolescents begin engaging with the idea of mortality and encounter something in reflective surfaces, something that the psychology literature actually documents, that is genuinely unsettling in ways that the conscious mind reaches for narrative to contain. The Jersey Devil didn't come from nothing. It came from 300 years of people in an isolated ecosystem encountering something that didn't fit their field guide and needed a name for it. The legend survived because the experiences keep happening. Not to everyone, but to enough people that the stories haven't died, and probably won't. Good night.